Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Carlo Gambino, the quiet mastermind who rose from the streets of Brooklyn to command one of the most powerful crime families in history. Known as the Boss of Bosses, Gambino ruled not with noise, but with silence, strategy, and an iron grip hidden behind calm eyes. As you close your eyes, picture the backroom deals, the whispered oaths, and the quiet empire built in the shadows. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening down in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and be part of the family. Now, breathe deep and let the silence take you in. Carlo Gambino came into the world on August 24, 1902, in the province of Palermo, Sicily, an island where tight-knit clans-shaped village life and disputes were handled far from courts. The code of silence omerta was not a slogan there. It was the way people survived. Elders taught that a man's word mattered, that family came first, and that you never invited the state into private affairs. As a teenager, he learned how influence worked. Favors owed, favors repaid. Patience preferred over fury. People who later met him said his greatest talent was self-control. He listened more than he spoke, rarely raised his tone, and saw 3 steps ahead. By the time he was in his late teens, according to later testimony and police files, he had ties to a local Sicilian brotherhood aligned with Cosa Nostra. The First World War and political upheaval squeezed Sicily hard. Jobs were scarce, prospects were limited, emigration called. In 1921, like many young men from his region, he crossed the Atlantic. Accounts say he slipped into the United States as a stowaway and stepped ashore at Norfolk, Virginia, before making his way to New York City. He settled in Brooklyn among relatives and countrymen, where dialects from western Sicily were more common than English, and where the old world had been rebuilt on new streets. Prohibition had begun a year earlier. The dry law created black markets overnight. New York's immigrant neighborhoods teemed with hidden bars, backroom wholesalers, bribed watchmen, and small fleets of trucks moving alcohol before dawn. Young Carlo proved useful in that world. He brought discipline, a calm face, and ties to Sicilian networks that valued discretion. He attached himself to men who already ran crews, learned the routes, memorized the names of foremen and police who looked the other way, and never took unnecessary risks. People noticed he did not drink to excess or flash money. He preferred a steady climb. His early path ran through the organization built by Salvatore Tequila, a powerful boss in Manhattan and Brooklyn. When Tequila was killed in 1928, the family passed through hands, and then the underworld entered a storm known as the Castellamarese War, a violent contest between factions led by Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Gambino kept his head down. He survived while older captains fell. Later accounts place him in the orbit of Alfred Mineo, and then, as the war ended in 1931, among those who accepted the settlement crafted by Charles Lucky Luciano. That settlement divided New York into 5 families with a commission to mediate disputes. The man set over one of those families was Vincent Mangano. Under Mangano, Carlo Gambino became a capo regime, a crew leader with his own earners and collectors. The new structure prized stability. Gambino flourished because he kept business quiet. Bootlegging still paid until the end of Prohibition in 1933, but his crews also took a cut from gambling, short-term lending at high interest, and protection schemes where businesses paid to avoid trouble. He learned to influence unions and use that leverage in legitimate industries. Trucking routes to the Brooklyn waterfront, seasonal produce markets, and the garment district in Manhattan offered steady, legal-looking cash flow when paired with friendly shop stewards and pliable local officials. He would later expand this model, but the seeds were planted in these years. Never rely on one racket, burrow into unions, keep violence away from public view, and make sure subordinates owe loyalty to you, not just to the family. He married Catherine Castellano in the mid-1920s, tying himself to another Brooklyn clan. This union made him brother-in-law to Paul Castellano, a link that would matter decades later. The household he kept reflected a pattern that served him well. Family dinners, limited public indulgence, and a careful routine. While others chased nightclubs and headlines, he preferred home and privacy. In 1937, he hit a legal wall. Federal agents secured a conviction for tax evasion tied to illicit income from his operations. He served roughly 22 months before returning to Brooklyn in 1939. For a man of his rank, that was a long lesson. He returned leaner in habits and even more cautious. He favored layered buffers, compartmentalized crews, and minimal paperwork. That stance, avoid anything that could be read, signed, or recorded, would define his management style for the rest of his life. Officers later complained that he seemed to vanish between an early morning coffee and a late supper, leaving little trace beyond rumors. The Second World War changed the city's rhythms. The docks became vital to the war effort. Federal authorities quietly reached understandings with mob-connected dock leaders to keep cargo moving. And while the famous agreement centered around other bosses, the climate benefited anyone with waterfront ties. Gambino deepened his reach into longshore locals and trucking depots. He did not try to run the piers by brute force. He made sure his associates chaired committees, controlled hiring halls, and influenced which companies got contracts. In the garment trade, he and allies positioned friendly trucking firms and warehouse services as the default choice. If a manufacturer wanted its dresses or coats moved on time without problems, it signed with those firms. That model generated steady, low-drama income and reduced the need for risky stunts. Inside the Mangano family, trouble simmered. The underboss, Albert Anastasia, was a charismatic and feared figure known across the underworld. Mangano resented how much sway Anastasia had, and Anastasia resented Mangano's attempts to curb him. Gambino read the room. He treated Anastasia's lieutenants with respect, delivered tribute reliably, and kept his own soldiers out of unnecessary feuds. He learned to operate under volatile leadership without getting burned. The 1940s closed with Gambino stronger than ever. His crews took their cut from bookmaking, loan sharking, and labor rackets at markets and on the waterfront. He steered clear of activities that drew intense federal focus, and he discouraged his men from bringing heat. He was known for discipline: no loud clubs, no celebrity friends, no flamboyant gifts. He preferred meetings in apartments or at small neighborhood spots, then long walks to be sure no one followed. He checked whether he was under watch the way other men checked the weather. In 1951, the storm inside the family broke. Vincent Mangano disappeared. His brother Philip was found dead in a marsh. No one in that world believed it was a mystery. Anastasia took control, with support from outside allies. Gambino stayed where he thrived, near the center, not on the edge. Under Anastasia, he advanced as a senior figure, a practical manager who could run crews and keep cash moving. He never advertised disagreement, but he watched how Anastasia's style, dramatic, forceful, pulled attention. Prosecutors built files. Newspapers gave the boss a nickname. Gambino, by contrast, erased himself from scenes as soon as a conversation ended. By now, the country had moved on from bootlegging, but the city teemed with other opportunities. Construction cranes swung over post-war New York. Markets hummed. Airports on Long Island grew from small fields into global gateways. Gambino's circle positioned themselves in trucking that served those hubs, in freight handling, and in unions that could slow or speed shipments. The methods were unlawful, but they relied on influence rather than spectacle votes in union halls, quiet pressure on negotiators, and the expectation that people would pay to avoid delays. If a company balked, insiders could lose paperwork, miss route loads, or prioritize a rival. Those were the levers. Alongside these ventures, he broadened his alliances. He respected bosses who kept their families stable. One of those was Thomas Lucchese, who shared Gambino's taste for low-profile growth and garment center influence. Their cooperation would later become a pillar of New York's underworld economy. Even at this stage, they exchanged favors. A labor problem smoothed here. A trucking contract opened there. A map of mid-century New York rackets would show their interests interlaced like threads. Through all of this, he faced law enforcement pressure. Detectives tailed him. State commissions summoned union officials tied to his crews. The IRS reviewed filings, yet he maintained a careful routine. Doctor visits when convenient, long walks around blocks to spot tails, and a courteous manner that gave away nothing. He put buffers everywhere. A dock shop steward met a capo's aide. The aide met a lieutenant. the lieutenant met a trusted friend, and only then did a message reach Gambino. That structure made cases hard to build. Witnesses saw fragments, not the whole. In the early 1950s, he watched a pattern play out across several families. Leaders who loved force and attention drew heat. Careful men prospered. When dust settled after an internal dispute, the low-voiced organizer often stood ready to take the wheel. He was a student of patience. He did not demand the top job. He created conditions where others would one day ask him to take it. He also reinforced a principle that would mark his reign. He did not want his men dealing in narcotics. Part of this was practical. Drug cases brought long sentences and relentless federal interest. Part was cultural. He preferred the older menu of rackets: gambling, loans, labor racketeering, commercial theft. Under him, participation in drug trafficking could bring serious internal consequences. That did not mean people under his umbrella never touched it. Some did, and some lied, but as a policy it set a tone that reduced exposure compared to rivals who plunged into that trade. This restraint, together with his habit of limiting exposure of decisions to a tight circle, helped him navigate the 1950s while high-profile peers stumbled. As the decade approached its midpoint, prosecutors took a broader swing at the underworld. Senate hearings drew national attention. Newspapers ran charts of shadow networks. Gambino's name appeared more often, though usually in cautious language like alleged or suspected. He did not respond. He left statements to lawyers when court filings required them and used illness or family obligations to avoid the rest. He cultivated a reputation for a weak heart that, whether entirely true or partly strategic, often helped him avoid lengthy proceedings. While his crews worked the markets and piers, he coached lieutenants in the art of staying small on paper. Keep businesses in the names of others. Avoid big bank deposits. Pay taxes on plausible incomes. Support local charities so neighbors speak well of you. The point was not image alone, it was insulation. When grand juries probed a local union, the names on documents were mid-level figures, not top decision-makers. That approach, combined with the careful way he issued orders, made it difficult to tie him directly to crimes that everyone in his world knew enriched his family's treasury. Inside his own house, he raised children who had seen their father leave early and return late, polite to a fault, never boasting about work. He valued loyalty and expected it in return. He did not forget favors and did not forgive betrayal. Yet he preferred to solve disputes with moves that looked like changes in assignment rather than open conflict. A stubborn borrower might find it harder to get goods to market. A restless soldier might be shifted to a slower corner of the operation. Only when quiet pressure failed did rougher remedies surface, and when they did, he was never the one standing in the doorway when police arrived. By 1955 and 1956, the Anastasia era showed signs of strain. Competitors resented the attention Anastasia drew. On the national stage, Vito Genovese maneuvered to take control of the family once led by Frank Costello. Alliances formed and cracked. Gambino kept channels open with leaders who valued order over spectacle. He understood that when big moves came, he needed the commission's approval, or at least its tolerance. He was not the flashpoint, he was the man who prepared for what the flashpoint would make possible. The stage was set for a turning point. In 1957, a cascade of events would rearrange power across New York. That story includes a famous ambush in a midtown hotel barbershop, a country meeting that police broke up in upstate New York, and a quiet ascent that put Carlo Gambino at the head of the family that would later bear his name. But that is for the next chapter. For now, we leave him in the mid-1950s, steady as a metronome, building influence through docks, trucks, markets, and unions, guiding his men toward low-visibility rackets, and practicing the discipline that would make him almost untouchable. He had waded through decades of upheaval, learned from every boss he served, and positioned himself so that when the city's map redrew itself, his address would move to the center without a shot fired in public view. New York in 1957 felt balanced on a narrow edge. Old loyalties were fraying, younger captains were impatient, and headlines began to sniff at names once spoken only in kitchens and back rooms. Carlo stayed patient. He watched without moving faster than he had to, the way a chess player resists grabbing a tempting pawn because he sees a better endgame. A bullet sliced through the city's calm in the spring when Frank Costello, a seasoned figure from another family, was shot and survived. That strike, widely viewed as Vito Genovese's bid to push Costello aside, made every senior man measure his own security. Albert Anastasia, Carlo's boss, continued to act with a flair that drew attention. Carlo kept his routine simple, his meetings short, his phone calls rare, and his circle tight. In late October, Albert Anastasia walked into the barber shop at the Park Sheraton Hotel and sat for a shave. Minutes later, two men entered, fired, and left. It was the end of an era and the start of another. No court ever proved who planned that killing. Law enforcement and many historians have long believed that Vito Genovese wanted Anastasia gone and that Carlo was aligned with that change. Some accounts add that Joe Profaci's people supplied the shooters. The details remain disputed, but the result is not. With Anastasia dead, the family needed a steady hand. Carlo had been building toward that moment for decades without announcing it. He stepped forward not as the loudest claimant, but as the chef who had been running the kitchen while the owner held court in the dining room. He did not call a crowded night meeting. He spoke to a few senior men one by one, gathered signatures the way a careful politician collects votes, and took command with a minimum of drama. He kept the existing shape where it made sense, changed it quietly where it did not. Joseph Biondo, a veteran, initially served as underboss. A trusted counselor handled delicate contacts. Captains who liked attention were nudged toward calmer habits or sidelined. Carlo asked for punctual tribute, low noise, and a return to the kind of rackets that enriched crews without setting reporters on fire. He repeated his standing rule against narcotics, knowing full well that absolute compliance was hard to enforce, but making it clear that anyone who forced him to choose between them and the family would not like the answer. His tone was even, and the message stuck. Only weeks later, on a country estate near the town of Apalachen, dozens of bosses and lieutenants gathered to discuss money and boundaries. State troopers, tipped off by unusual traffic, crashed the meeting and chased men through hedges and woods. Many were detained and identified. Carlo was widely believed to have been present. If he was there, he did what he did best. He left almost no trace. He was not among those logged by police that day. The impact was enormous. Until then, senior officials sometimes treated talk of a national syndicate as rumor. Appalachian forced acknowledgement. It also brought more scrutiny. Carlo responded by shrinking his public footprint even further: shorter drives, longer walks, fewer visible companions, doctor's notes about a weak heart whenever a hearing loomed. With Anastasia gone and Appalachian tightening the lens, he set about turning the family into a disciplined, diversified enterprise. He favored rackets that looked like logistics problems solved for a price. On the waterfront, he preferred influence over brute force. Control the hiring halls, influence which trucks load first, place shop stewards who understand priorities. If a company cooperated, cargo moved. If not, delays multiplied. In the garment district, trucking firms and warehouse services tied to his people became the default option for designers and manufacturers who wanted smooth passage from cutting floor to showroom. Casinos and dice games stayed, but his background music, the steady money, came from the flow of goods. Idlewild Airport, soon to be renamed for President Kennedy, was expanding into a global hub. Carlo's lieutenants moved into air freight and baggage handling through union locals and front firms that bid for contracts. Boxes went missing less when fees were paid and more when they weren't. It was the same principle as the docks, adapted to a new frontier. Know who assigns shifts, know which doors matter. Keep the pressure quiet and constant. Newark and LaGuardia fit into that web too, all linked by trucks that answered to friendly dispatchers and shop bosses. His alliance with Thomas Lucchese ripened into a partnership that shaped whole sectors. Lucchese's people were strong in garment trucking and some construction trades. Carlo brought waterfront and airport leverage. Together they steered contracts, eased labor disputes for those who played along, and tightened the screws on those who didn't. Politicians liked calm. Businesses liked schedules. Both learned to make calls to the right intermediaries. If a project needed to pour concrete without a stoppage, someone in the room would eventually say, "Talk to them." It was not a speech, it was a nudge. Federal pressure grew. Robert F. Kennedy, first as Senate counsel and later as Attorney General, targeted organized crime with new energy. Carlo's name surfaced in reports and memos, described as an alleged leader who preferred back rooms to limelight. He let attorneys answer subpoenas. When a hearing demanded his presence, he arrived looking frail, spoke briefly, and gave nothing away. He was already in his 50s, and the heart story, whether entirely accurate or partly strategy, fit his careful public posture. Tales discovered he liked to walk blocks around his house, stop in a small shop, and then walk again, changing cadence to spot a pattern. He seldom used the same route twice in a week. Inside the organization, he broadened the bench. He kept Biondo under him for a time, then, according to later accounts, shifted power to Aniello della Croce, a disciplined street figure respected by rank-and-file earners. That move balanced the family. Della Croce inspired loyalty among crews who lived by the older code: cash on the table, envelopes handed over, no paperwork. Carlo's brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, managed businesses that touched food distribution, construction supply, and other corners where contracts looked legitimate and profits were high. Two wings emerged under one roof, one that favored blue-collar rackets, another that leaned into suits and invoices. Carlo sat above both and blended their strengths. The city's other families were rarely quiet. After Joe Profaci died of natural causes in 1962, his organization convulsed. A plot by Profaci's successor, Joseph Magliocco, and Joseph Bonanno to strike at their rivals, including Carlo and Lucchese, came to light in 1963. The man asked to carry out part of that plan, Joseph Colombo, chose to alert the targets instead. Carlo did not thunder. He used the commission to address it. Magliocco was forced to step down and fined. Colombo, rewarded for his disclosure, and seen as a stabilizer, took command of the old Profaci outfit, which soon carried his name. That result told the city how Carlo preferred to rule: contain the damage, avoid brawls that spill into newspapers, and elevate those who keep the market running. Vito Genovese, convicted on a narcotics charge in 1959, tried to run his family from prison, but his reach kept shrinking. With Genovese boxed in, Carlo and Lucchese effectively chaired the commission. They brokered settlements, divided territories, and set the pace for joint ventures. The 1963 testimony of Joseph Valakai, a Genovese soldier turned government witness, exposed the structure of Cosa Nostra to a national audience and named Carlo as a boss. The curtain ripped open. Carlo responded by lowering his profile even more. He kept home life orderly, visited his doctor, and declined interviews. In 1,000 small choices: walk, not drive; whisper, not call. Paper receipt in someone else's name, he survived, while louder men jammed themselves into cages. Money flowed from an array of sources: bookmaking, loans at tough rates, protection payments from businesses seeking predictability, commercial theft at warehouses, and slices from construction jobs. A growing piece came from private sanitation, where carting routes and trade associations could be arranged to keep competitors out and prices up. Another came from the building trades that fed the city's boom. Firms that poured concrete or hauled materials learned the system. Hire certain companies, respect union decisions that seem to appear out of thin air. Don't fight over pennies when a schedule can cost millions. Carlo's people were there as problem solvers. Law enforcement tried new tools. Electronic surveillance expanded. Taxes became a favored route for prosecutors. Informants were cultivated. Carlo adjusted. He placed buffers between himself and money, between himself and threats. A union steward talked to a foreman. The foreman dealt with a contractor. A contractor spoke to a businessman. Only then, if at all, would a message make its way up. That latter meant that if one rung broke, the whole scaffold did not collapse. When an associate got arrested, lawyers appeared quickly, families were supported, and pressure to talk was met with reminders of loyalty and practical help. He also practiced boundary management inside his own ranks. If a captain let greed override discipline, he was reminded that slow money lasts longer than fast money. If someone tried to freeload on the family's reputation without paying tribute, that person might find jobs harder to get and permits harder to keep. When tempers flared between crews, he moved men, reassigned corners, or brought a lunch at a quiet table where pride could be saved and rules restated. Violence existed in that world, but under Carlo it was usually the last card, not the first. That was part moral code, part risk management. By the mid-1000s, 960s, his grip was firm. He had outlived a war in the early 1930s, a flamboyant boss, a national police shock at Appalachian, and the first big wave of federal attention. He remained a figure many New Yorkers never noticed, a small man with a soft voice who might be seen on Ocean Parkway taking the air. Inside his sphere, he was the final word. Outside it, he blended into the city's noise so well that neighbors described him as polite and private. The contrast was not an act. It was the product of a lifetime of caution. In 1965 and 1966, he made further adjustments. According to investigators, he reduced Joseph Biondo's authority after hearing of side deals and promoted Aniello Della Croce as the operational anchor for the rank and file. That reassured soldiers who worried that too much of the family's attention had drifted to corporate-style schemes. It also let Carlo use Paul Castellano's business skills without losing the street's respect. He held both wings together by keeping promises, paying attention to details, and never letting a debate about money become a debate about respect. When Thomas Lucchese fell ill and died in 1967, Carlo's influence grew again. He could not command another family directly, but his counsel carried weight. He favored leaders who stayed calm and kept unions cooperative. He nudged the Lucchese line toward men who shared that approach. He still met selectively, chose his words carefully, and left rooms with the sense that nothing had happened even when the course of a company or a borough had been changed. All through these years, he remained careful about narcotics. Some in his orbit, tempted by enormous profits, strayed. If they were caught and exposed, they often found themselves isolated, their protection gone. The policy did not stop every shipment or every scheme, but it limited the kind of cases that had sent other bosses away for decades. His eye for risk saved him again and again. When investigators asked how such a famous name could go so long without a long sentence, the answer was unglamorous. Patience, compartmentalization, and the habit of acting as if every conversation might someday be read back in a courtroom. By the close of the decade, he had guided his family from the storm of 1957 into a long stretch of profitability and relative calm, at least compared to rivals. The city had changed airports, hummed, suburbs grew. Television added glare, but his rules did not. Stay small in public, diversify income, avoid hot crimes, cultivate union influence, and keep a layer between decision and action. That formula would be tested in the years ahead, when an abduction inside his extended circle would hit close to home, and when acts of revenge would pull new names into history. For now, he walked the same Brooklyn streets, a careful man with a long memory, still collecting chips from a board he had helped design. The turn of the decade found him steady while the city grew louder. Movies and headlines made the underworld look like a stage show. But Carlo still treated it like a ledger and a map. He woke early, walked slowly, and trimmed every risk he could see. He had no taste for rallies or cameras. When the Italian-American Civil Rights League surged into view under Joseph Colombo in 1970, Carlo kept his distance. The League brought attention, and attention brought subpoenas. It bothered him to watch a fellow boss give interviews. He preferred the old habit, do not explain yourself to the public. He sent no speeches, offered no quotes, and told his people to keep their names out of papers. That same year, a new law changed the ground under everyone's feet. RICO gave prosecutors a way to link many acts into one case, and to aim those cases at leaders, not just the men on the street. Carlo understood what that meant. He made his circles tighter, his conversations shorter, and his use of the telephone even rarer. He used doctor's notes to limit court time. He coached captains to stay modular. If one crew fell, the others should keep moving. He repeated his rules about records, about fronts, about how money should move in quiet channels through companies that looked ordinary. It was not glamour. It was survival. The garment center still hummed for him. Trucking firms with friendly owners won routes by habit, not by signs on doors. Shop stewards guided shifts. A late delivery could ruin a season, so manufacturers paid for certainty. At the same time, airport freight became a core concern. Idlewild, now called John F. Kennedy International, absorbed planes like a tide pool pulls in waves. Union locals there decided who lifted crates and whose paperwork cleared first. If those locals were calm, cargo flowed. If they were annoyed, paperwork stalled and boxes waited. Carlo's people learned every corridor and every loading protocol. The money did not look like a jackpot. It looked like a fee for no problems, collected every day. His alliance with Thomas Lucchese held firm. They helped each other set the pace of the commission and solve disputes before they cracked open. When a contractor complained about costs, someone explained the cost of delays. When a union grew restless, a meeting at a quiet table cooled it down. The city's growth fed their model. More buildings, more goods, more trucks, more leverage. Other bosses saw the logic and copied parts of it, but few matched Carlo's discipline. In June 1971, the city saw how fast attention could turn. Joseph Colombo was shot at a rally and left gravely injured. The shooter died on the spot. The reasons remained debated. Some pointed at internal rivals. Others thought different forces wanted the league silenced. Carlo did not join the speculation. He pushed for calm through the commission, pressed the Colombo family to avoid an open street war, and tried to keep business moving. The chaos did not end overnight. Joseph Gallo, a restless figure from the Colombo family, left prison, and soon after was killed in 1972 at a Little Italy restaurant. Many believe that was a Colombo matter. Carlo's focus stayed on stability. He favored outcomes that stopped the bleeding and restored order. Another shock hit closer. In May 1972, his nephew Emmanuel, known as Manny, was kidnapped in a case that combined ransom demands with reckless bravado. The crime was not a myth told years later. It was on the record, reported in papers and tracked by detectives. The family searched, the police searched, and the story ended in grief. The kidnapping crew included James McBratney, part of a small group that had begun targeting people they believed could pay, a dangerous game in that world. The loss cut deep. Carlo, who favored quiet pressure over outbursts, authorized a response through proper channels inside his organization. The following spring, 1973, McBratney was confronted in a Staten Island bar by a young crew that included John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and Ralph Gallioni. The plan, built on a ruse, turned violent when the target resisted. McBratney died. Arrests followed. Gotti later pleaded to a lesser count tied to that case and served time. The message inside the life was clear without any speeches. Kidnapping family members would not be tolerated. Through all of this, Carlo kept repeating his standing line on narcotics. Stay out. He knew he could not police every choice in a city of millions, but as policy, it helped him avoid the long sentences and federal storms that drug cases brought down on other outfits. When someone under his flag got caught in a drug case, protection did not come easy. That policy did not make him a reformer. It made him a conservative businessman in a criminal economy, weighing risk and return without romance. He remained the top of the largest family in the country, measured by crews and reach. Estimates varied, but investigators agreed his house outnumbered the others. It had blue-collar crews on the street, whitey-collar earners in offices, and a second layer of associates who held licenses, leases, and positions in trade groups. This blend made the money feel steady. It also made cases against him hard to build. He still met in apartments, still walked to and from errands with a careful pace, still cut off a conversation once it grew specific. People close to him said he never forgot the prison term in the 1930s. He acted like every choice could echo. The federal government tried another route: deportation. Carlo had arrived in the United States without inspection in 1921. Through the 1960s and early 1970s, immigration officials and federal prosecutors pushed to send him back to Italy. He fought every attempt with filings, appeals, and medical claims. Heart trouble, his lawyers said, made travel dangerous and hearings burdensome. Judges asked for documentation. Doctors signed letters. In the end, the clock helped him. Proceedings dragged, and he stayed where he had built his life. Inside his family, he refined the balance between two wings. Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, focused on businesses that had offices and invoices, food distribution, building supply, service firms that won contracts in the open market, but were helped by friends in unions. Aniello Della Croce, the underboss after Joseph Biondo fell from favor, commanded loyalty on the street, where bookmakers, collectors, and hijack crews kept envelopes moving. Carlo sat above both, pulled them into alignment when pride or money caused friction, and kept them rowing in the same direction. He understood that the family worked best when both wings felt respected. He made sure they did. His reach extended beyond the 5 families. He enjoyed a steady tie with Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia, a man who shared his instinct for quiet wealth. They spoke through trusted intermediaries, smoothed borders, and kept feuds from turning into headlines. He also kept lines open to Milwaukee's Frank Balistrieri and allied figures in New Jersey. These relationships did not look like parades. They looked like lunch. A drive, a short talk, a nod, then back to routine. That was his style. At home, he was doting and private. He preferred to eat with family, to watch his grandchildren, to keep the house in order. Neighbors saw an older man who prized routine. He did not drink heavily, did not shout, did not host noisy gatherings on the block. The duality remained, a calm presence on the sidewalk and a figure of immense power in rooms the public never saw. By the mid-1970s, law enforcement pressure reached into every corner of the city. Electronic surveillance became more common. Grand jury subpoenas stacked up at union offices. Undercover agents tried to map who spoke to whom at corner cafes. Carlo sensed the shift. He kept his composure and doubled down on old rules. If you needed to meet, pick a space that is yours, not a public place. If you needed to share a message, use a person, not a device. If you were tempted to show off money, do not. He preferred men who could sit in a diner with a modest suit and look like any other customer. He also refined the way the family handled construction. He did not invent the idea of standardizing concrete and framing jobs through a small circle, but he gave it structure by backing a practice where a select set of companies got first call on big pours and key contracts. That made scheduling easier for builders who played along, and made defiance expensive for those who did not. Local unions, especially in trucking and concrete, were part of the system. Dues got paid. Jobs moved on time. Money flowed in a circle that touched labor halls, dispatchers, and job sites. On paper, it was just construction. In practice, it was a gate with quiet tolls. In 1974 and 1975, his health became harder to ignore. He had lived a careful life, but age made every step slower. He still walked, still took the air, still sat in the same chairs at the same hours, but he tired more easily. He began thinking about succession. The choice was delicate. Della Croce had the street behind him. Castellano had the business network and family tie. Picking one could anger the other and split the house he had kept whole for nearly 2 decades. He chose a path only he could manage, name Paul Castellano as boss, and secure a promise from Della Croce to accept that decision and remain under boss, respected and powerful. He did this not by decree in a crowded room, but by a sequence of quiet talks, appeals to loyalty, and reminders of how much they all had to lose if pride ran wild. The 2 men agreed. The house stayed intact. He also made sure the commission understood the plan. He had earned the right to shape his own succession. Other bosses saw the logic. Castellano would keep the white-collar side productive. Della Croce would keep the street faithful. Both would prevent a war. The plan did not erase all tension, but it set guardrails. Men who loved Carlo accepted his last request. Keep the peace, keep the money steady, keep the family whole. His final year played out like a soft fade. He remained under surveillance, but the cases were thin. He visited doctors. He saw his grandchildren. He kept track of crews through brief updates and stayed interested in how unions were voting and which contracts were coming up. He knew which airports were busiest, which terminals were hiring, which wholesalers in the food market had expanded, and how. His mind stayed sharp, even as his body slowed. On October 15, 1976, at his home on Long Island, Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack. He was 74. There was no dramatic scene. No camera caught him. Family and a few close friends tended to arrangements. The funeral drew attention from law enforcement because of who might appear, but the moment itself was private. He left behind a family that bore his name, a map of influence that he had drawn with patience, and a set of rules that kept him free far longer than most men who reached his height. His legacy inside that world was not a painting or a quote. It was a style. He taught that power could grow in silence, that loud moves short-circuit long plans, and that the best profit is the kind that arrives day after day without a headline. He showed that union halls could be as vital as back rooms, that contracts could be shaped by who answered phones, that a hiring hall could control a peer as surely as any muscle. He proved that a boss could steer decades without a spectacle, and that the city itself could become a machine for quiet revenue if you knew its gears. The story did not end with him. By naming Paul Castellano and holding Delacroce's loyalty, he set the stage for the next act, one that would pull new names into view and test whether his restraint could survive without him. Within a handful of years, a different kind of energy would push to the front, and the balance he built would tilt. For the moment, though, the door closed on a life that had reshaped the market he entered as a stowaway. He had outlived wars, outlasted rivals, dodged deportation, and kept a massive organization functioning through law changes, media glare, and internal storms. People still argue about his choices. Some remember him as a quiet architect of corruption in labor and logistics. Others point to his refusal to embrace narcotics as a sign of caution that spared the city some harm. What is clear is that he imposed order on men who could have torn each other apart, that he made illegal money look like logistics, and that he left a structure that endured long after his chair was empty. His death did not end scrutiny. It began a new phase in which his successors would either honor his methods or throw them aside. The house Carlo built had to live on its own once he was gone. He had left a plan, not a vacuum. Paul Castellano would sit in the big chair. Aniello Delacroce would stay as the field marshal, respected by rank-and-file crews who handled bookmaking, collections, and day-to-day enforcement. The idea was simple. The suits would mine contracts and companies that looked lawful. The street would keep cash moving and rules intact. Both sides would feel seen. This balance had worked because Carlo held it with quiet authority. Now the balance had to survive on trust he had earned over decades. Paul took office with a certain stiffness. He liked ledgers, meetings, and offices where deals came with invoices. He guarded the food supply trade, building materials, and service businesses that fed the city's growth. He wanted receipts, not noise. Delacroce kept the men who lived in social clubs and traveled in plain cars to collect, settle disputes, and shield higher-ups from heat. For a time, the arrangement held. It echoed Carlo's style. Keep violence out of sight, avoid narcotics, cultivate union influence, and diversify income so no single loss could topple the whole. Carlo's son Thomas strengthened the garment center grip. Garment trucking firms and loading docks stayed friendly. Designers who needed a seasonal line delivered on time used those companies because deliveries arrived and headaches did not. At the airports, baggage and cargo handling remained a lever. These were the same gears Carlo had oiled. Paul did not need to reinvent them. He only had to keep the machine aligned and remind the commission that nothing wild would come from his corner. The late 1970s brought new stress. Prosecutors leaned on RICO and electronic surveillance. Union reformers challenged old guards. Anthony Scotto, a Brooklyn waterfront leader with political ties, came under federal scrutiny. He was charged in 1979 for taking bribes and evading taxes and later convicted. The case signaled that the docks, a pillar of income since Carlo's early years, would no longer be treated as a sleepy backwater. Reporters wrote about labor racketeering with more detail than before. Paul responded with more insulation. More buffers between money and the men at the top. More care with who spoke to whom. More attention to which restaurants and homes might be wired. Inside the family, differences in style began to show. Paul favored schedules, new ventures, and carefully structured monopolies. He preferred business attire and dinner tables, far from corner hangouts. Delacroce stayed rooted in the social clubs along First Avenue and in Little Italy. Under him, captains like John Gotti learned how to keep crews motivated and envelopes full. Gotti, who had gained standing after the McBratney case tied to the kidnapping of Carlo's nephew, thrived with attention in a way Carlo had never liked. As long as Delacroce lived, those personalities did not collide openly. Respect for Carlo's design kept the peace. Beyond New York, alliances Carlo had cultivated still mattered. Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia had been a quiet neighbor, steering his city with calm. His murder in 1980 rattled the region and showed how quickly a system can unravel when restraint ends. The contrast with Carlo's era was clear. Across the river in New Jersey, fights over garbage hauling and construction brought indictments that named men who, in earlier years, might have stayed out of view. Television and tabloids changed the mood too. The public now recognized faces that once walked through life as cipher and rumor. At home, Paul expanded the white-collar wing. Private sanitation routes became more organized under trade associations that looked legitimate but, according to later cases, enforced a closed shop that set prices and shut newcomers out. Construction grew into a centerpiece. Developers wanted predictability. A small circle of concrete suppliers and contractors began to get first call on large jobs. Union locals in trucking and building trades fit into that structure. On paper, it was coordination. In court, years later, prosecutors called it a cartel. The roots ran back to Carlo's long-standing push to make the city's growth pay in regular, low-drama ways. The scale, however, grew under Paul. The FBI adjusted. Teams placed microphones where men felt safest. In the early 1980s, agents hid devices inside Paul's Staten Island home. The tapes captured a boss at a desk, not a man in a back booth, talking about money, crews, and how to handle trouble. Those recordings became a backbone for later indictments that framed the entire leadership as participants in an ongoing criminal enterprise. Carlo had spent a lifetime preventing exactly that kind of evidence. He walked instead of called, met in bare apartments, and cut off any talk that strayed into specifics. Paul's comfort with long talks in a private home created a different kind of exposure. As government cases thickened, the old compact between the family's two wings came under strain. Street earners felt that men in suits took bigger shares while demanding deference. White-collar managers thought the clubs drew heat by celebrating reputation instead of protecting revenue. Carlo's model had balanced these instincts with his personal weight and a habit of making both sides feel essential. Without him, small resentments gained inches. Delacroix spent more of his time putting out internal fires. A separate pressure came from narcotics. Paul, like Carlo, rejected drug dealing as policy. But on the ground, temptation persisted. Some crews, chasing quick money, drifted toward it. Arrests followed. Each arrest added friction. A captain who felt unsupported pointed a finger at the desk. A manager accused the street of ignoring clear rules. Carlo's firm line had deterred some of this drift. After him, enforcement of the rule depended on personal loyalty more than shared culture. Meanwhile, federal prosecutors in Manhattan prepared sweeping cases aimed at the city's top leadership. The commission indictment of 1985 alleged that bosses and underbosses from several families rigged construction markets, controlled unions, and resolved disputes through a central council. The case drew on wiretaps, informants, and financial records. It named names at the very top, including Paul. At the same time, a separate case accused him of running schemes through companies tied to his household and inner circle. He was arrested, released on bail, and ordered to limit contacts. He spent long days at home on Staten Island, while lawyers fought motions and the press circled. Then Delacroix fell ill. He died in late 1985, taking with him the living bridge that connected Paul to the rank and file. The funeral drew a sea of men from the street side of the house. Paul did not appear, citing bail terms and legal advice. To those who revered Delacroix, the absence felt like a slight. Old patience cracked. John Gotti, who had long chafed at Paul's style and pressure, saw an opening. What followed would mark a sharp turn away from Carlo's careful playbook. On a winter evening in Manhattan, Paul and his new underboss, Thomas Bellotti, were ambushed outside a midtown steakhouse and killed. The killers were not caught that night. It was a public act that echoed the 1957 barbershop killing that had opened Carlo's path, but with a crucial difference in tone. Carlo had moved like a parliamentarian, counting votes and ensuring commission tolerance before big changes. The 1985 strike shouted its arrival. Within days, Gotti presented himself as the new boss, gathering support from crews loyal to Delacroix and daring rivals to stop him. The commission, itself battered by indictments, could not enforce a veto with the old certainty. The family that bore Carlo's name shifted into a new era defined by a leader who embraced cameras and attention in ways Carlo had avoided all his life. The outcome underlined what made Carlo distinctive. He had believed that rule by calm example protected the treasury and the people who fed it. He liked quiet corridors, not crowded entrances. He thought the best kind of power is the kind no one sees until a decision appears as consensus. The spectacle of 1,985 broke with that ethos. Telephoto lenses met street corner cheers. Lawsuits and trials followed. Law enforcement, which had struggled for decades to put handcuffs on bosses, now faced a figure who loved the spotlight. Bugs and informants multiplied. Prosecutors built cases not only on the quiet paperwork of unions and contracts, but also on recorded boasts and public patterns. Yet, even as the style shifted, many systems Carlo had assembled kept working. Garment trucking remained a steady stream into the 1990s. Airports still offered opportunities through mishandled freight and union influence. Private carting held its shape until regulators dismantled the protected routes. Construction continued as a field where schedules created leverage, though the biggest schemes drew heavy sentences once the commission case took hold. His son Thomas became a central figure in garment center cases years later, a sign of how deep those roots ran. In that sense, Carlo's legacy outlasted the change in charisma. Looking back across the bridge from the 1980s to the years when Carlo walked Ocean Parkway, you can see how his decisions set guardrails. He taught subordinates to think about risk as a daily diet, not an emergency meal. He modeled a mode of speech that used as few words as possible. He scaled rackets that looked like logistics solutions for businesses, not roulette wheels for thrill seekers. Those choices minimized arrests at the top during his reign and made it harder for prosecutors to tell easy stories to juries. He saw that public violence caused waves that did not stop at the curb. When unavoidable, it had to be contained and never tied to the family head. You can also see limits. The system depended on a boss who could persuade proud men to accept their lane. That was a rare skill. After he died, the bond frayed. The city changed too. Surveillance changed. Federal laws reached higher and further. What had been invisible became legible to agents who learned to follow not only the cash in brown envelopes, but also the minutes of trade associations and the shift sheets at warehouses. Carlo's low-profile method delayed that shift, but it could not freeze history. The deeper legacy sits in how the city remembers him. Neighbors recall an older man who kept to himself and walked every day. Detectives recall a figure who seemed always one corner ahead. Business owners from his era remember that if they paid the right companies, trucks showed up and departures were on time. Historians point to his long refusal to tie his brand to narcotics as a tactical choice that spared him long sentences. Families of victims of underworld pressure remember fear and loss that never made the news. All of those strands are true at once. In a life that started in a Sicilian village and ended in a quiet room on Long Island, he built a power that spanned docks, markets, airports, and union halls. He avoided speeches, awards, and photographs, and yet his signature patience, planning, control, stayed visible long after he was gone. The years after his death show both the durability of his design and the break that came when style replaced restraint. That contrast explains why his name still stands apart in lists of bosses who rose and fell faster. He turned the city into a machine that paid without crashing, and he trained men to oil it without drawing a crowd. When that training slipped, the machine still ran for a while, but it shook. Walk back a step and picture the city as Carlo saw it. Not a skyline, but a web. Every line is a truck route, a union hall, a loading bay, a dispatcher's desk, a steward's phone, a superintendent's clipboard. Somewhere at the center sits a small, quiet figure who moves less than others but knows which string to touch. He learned early that power in New York rarely rests in grand offices. It hides in appointment books and shift lists. If the right person sets a schedule, 1,000 people feel it before lunch. That was the theater he preferred. Slow, careful scenes with no applause. Start at the docks. For decades, the waterfront was a living machine. Cargo arrived, men lined up, forklifts rolled, whistles blew, paperwork shuffled. Before reforms, day laborers crowded the morning shape-up, hoping a hiring boss picked them. Over time, hiring halls and lists replaced parts of that old ritual, but influence still mattered. A steward could move a man up or down. A foreman could make a crate appear, or vanish on paper. Carlo understood that controlling the pace of the pier was more profitable than seizing a crate. He made sure friends sat where schedules were made, not where fists flew. Companies that wanted a smooth week found themselves talking with intermediaries who offered labor peace. Those who paid worked without surprises. Those who didn't learn that patience on the dock could be measured in days. The same logic fit the garment district. By dawn, 7th Avenue and the cross streets filled with cutters, pressers, and pattern makers. A whole season could hinge on getting dresses from a floor on 38th Street to a buyer in Midtown or a port across the river. Carlo's world placed friendly trucking firms as the default carriers. No need to bully a seamstress or halt a factory. Simply control who the dispatcher calls first and which loading dock gets a ramp at noon. Designers paid for reliability. Drivers with ties to his circle got the work. If a client drifted, things slowed traffic where there had been none. A switch in a warehouse schedule. A missing pallet that turned up after a manager made a call. It looked like Manhattan's daily chaos. It was policy. Airports became a new frontier with old rules. At Idlewild, later JFK, and at LaGuardia and Newark, air freight arrived with tight deadlines and delicate cargo. A missing box could ruin a shipment. A delayed manifest could hold a pallet for hours. Carlo's people learned the rhythms of cargo terminals, which doors mattered, which night supervisors could be persuaded to see a point your way, which union locals controlled which tasks. The cash did not rain down. It accumulated. A fee here, a contract steered there, a friendly guard who looked the other way at the right moment, all the tiny decisions that turned jet-age speed into steady income. Private sanitation offered another steady current. Garbage moves every day, in all weather, across every block. For small businesses, predictable pickup is oxygen. Trade associations promised order across competing carting companies. Investigators later accused those associations of keeping out newcomers and setting non-competitive prices. In Carlo's time, the system made collections hum and arguments fade. He valued predictability more than spikes of profit. Regular pickups meant regular envelopes. It also meant fewer fights on street corners and more decisions in back offices. The construction boom was a canvas for his preference for structure. Developers dread delays. A concrete pour that misses a window can idle a site, trap cranes, and burn money. He favored arrangements where a short list of suppliers handled the largest pours, and union locals worked in sequence that everyone understood. Builders willing to coordinate enjoyed smooth calendars. Those who fought learned how costly a stoppage could be. Years later, prosecutors would call this a cartel and label the circle of suppliers a club. In Carlo's day, participants simply called it the way things got done. He did not invent concrete. He perfected the incentives that surrounded it. Inside the organization, he set habits that made cases thin. He avoided phones, avoided notes, avoided meetings with large audiences. He liked apartments, parks, and walks where a gust of wind could carry away a sentence. He spoke elliptically. He used people as buffers. A captain would not bring him a request directly. A trusted go-between would carry a summary stripped of names. Orders returned in the same way. This did not guarantee safety, but it meant that when police built a chart, the lines to him looked faint and speculative. Witnesses saw slices of the pie, not the baker. He also helped enforce a rule that changed the organization's demography. For years, the book stayed closed. After the 1957 shock in upstate New York, top leaders largely stopped making new members. The policy, observed broadly across New York, limited who knew the rituals and who could claim formal status. Carlo liked what that meant. Fewer ceremonies meant fewer leaks. The men inside the circle were older, proven, and usually more careful. Associates still did most of the labor, but the number of men who could attend a high-level sit-down did not swell. When the books reopened around the time he died, a new wave entered, but for much of his tenure, stability trumped recruitment. He kept another hard rule on narcotics. He believed drug cases carried too much risk for leaders and too much time for those caught. He did not pretend drugs weren't in the city. He told his people not to make them part of the family's portfolio. Compliance was imperfect, but the policy set tone. When someone brought a drug problem to his door, the answer was often distance. That spared him the spectacular federal prosecutions that toppled other bosses and made headlines that rocked entire families. The financial logic of his world was simple but disciplined. Every crew had earners. Every earner paid a portion to his captain. Captains paid a portion to the administration. Holiday tribute mattered. Debts were recorded in heads, not ledgers. If a borrower fell behind, pressure escalated in stages: a phone call, a visit, a lost opportunity, and, only if all else failed, a rougher reminder. He preferred that no one had to raise a hand. A dock slowdown, a route change, a lost permit worked better than a broken bone. One left no paper. The other left a police report. Unions were both tool and shield. He did not own unions. He influenced them. That difference is crucial. Friendly officers and stewards could steer votes, set priorities, and calm tempers. In return, unions got steady employment, full dues, and backing against rivals. Politicians appreciated the quiet. Campaigns need volunteers and checks. Labor peace wins headlines. Both materialized when he wanted them to. Connected attorneys, fixers, and consultants completed the circuit, turning friction into signatures. When reformers rose, as they often did, he regrouped. He did not fight every battle. He picked spots where leverage was strongest, often at the points where a delay would cost the most. His media strategy was absence. He never formed a public league, never gave a speech, never sought to explain himself to reporters. He told no origin stories, shared no jokes at banquets, and left no quotable lines. That was not just modesty. It was a tactic. Newsprint kept names alive. Broadcasts made faces familiar. He chose to be indistinct. That made surveillance harder. It also made it easier for neighbors to believe he was a benign elder who liked fresh air and family dinners. Law enforcement pushed forward anyway. Tax cases, immigration cases, labor racketeering cases, he faced them all. His counter was consistency. He used medical notes to limit appearances. He hired lawyers who specialized in process. He arrived on time, looked frail, spoke little, and left. He refused to treat courtrooms as stages, which deprived prosecutors of the thrill of wrestling with a blustery villain. He ran out clocks. He beat some counts, lost some, endured the rest. The alliances he maintained across families were part diplomacy, part risk control. He preferred neighbors who valued steadiness. Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia, for example, and leaders in New Jersey who ran things without fireworks. He saw New York like a crowded apartment building. Too much noise from one unit brought the superintendent. He worked to keep the hallway quiet. When problems blew in from elsewhere, the fallout from a narcotics case in another borough, a feud over a corner in Queens, he offered the commission a solution: a fine, a reassignment, an apology enforced with subtle pressure. He did not need enemies. He needed predictability. His home life reinforced the aura that protected him. He lived modestly for a man in his position. He kept routine. Early walks, family meals, polite nods to neighbors. He did not surround himself with loud cars or loud friends. That did not make him harmless, but it blurred the outline. Detectives were left staking out a man who looked like a grandfather and behaved like one most of the day. While they watched the stoop, messages traveled by hand between men who never appeared alongside him. He taught his captains a method for listening. Hear the complaint under the complaint. If a business owner gripes about price, he may really fear a delay. If a steward resents a foreman, he may really seek respect. Solve the real thing, and income follows. That way of thinking pushed his people toward arrangements rather than tantrums. A tantrum was loud and risky. An arrangement paid weekly. What he built had costs for others. Honest reformers and unions faced headwinds. Companies that wanted to bid without favors lost contracts or paid more than market. Workers who refused to play along sometimes found fewer shifts. These harms often unfolded without a scene, which made them harder to document but no less real. His success depended on keeping those costs hidden inside routine. From a distance, the city looked normal. Trucks moved, runways cleared, Buildings rose. Inside, choices were narrower than they appeared. He also lived with limits. His caution could not freeze time. The law evolved. Wiretaps became smaller and clearer. RICO created a lattice that let prosecutors present many acts as one enterprise and reach the men at the top. Public taste shifted. Headlines sold. A new generation of figures inside his own family and beyond liked attention. Attention made cases easier to sell to juries. His methods bought decades, not immunity forever. Because he prized long game over short thrills, his legacy is visible in systems more than stories. Consider the garment routes. Long after his death, investigators traced how a small set of carriers dominated certain corridors and how exclusive deals kept out rivals. Or look at concrete in the early 1980s, when a federal team mapped an alleged club of suppliers and consultants who fed one another contracts. Or the airport theft squads that uncovered networks of handlers who treated select pallets like private stock. These were not accidents. They were echoes of the template he had set. He also left a human legacy. He mentored men who could sit for hours and say almost nothing. He rewarded reliability over flash. His brother-in-law Paul learned how to turn family ties into business leverage, even if later tapes undid him. Aniello Della Croce learned how to keep the rank-and-file loyal without daily crises. Younger figures like John Gotti learned that swift, symbolic acts could change everything, but they did not absorb Carlo's allergy to attention. Each student took a piece, none took the whole. For historians, detectives, and reporters, he remains both documented and elusive. Court files mention him as an alleged leader. Memoirs from witnesses outline meetings where his opinions carried the day, yet the tape that would have dramatized him never surfaced. He left behind no cinematic set pieces, no reckless remarks. The result is a portrait built from the behavior of systems, more than the quotes of a man. You see him in the way a peer quieted after a call, in the way a foreman adjusted a list, in the way a project poured on time after a lunch few people noticed. If you want to understand how he stayed free as long as he did, do not look for magic. Look for habits. He walked instead of drove. He met in private instead of public. He shared less instead of more. He diversified so that a hit in one sector felt like a bruise, not a broken bone. He favored low-heat crimes, gambling, loans, extortion behind union leverage over the white-hot glow of drugs. He accepted that some income would be smaller in exchange for a longer run. In a life where many sprint and fall, he jogged. In the end, his design became a kind of orthodoxy for men who prized survival. It was not clean or fair. It bent unions, taxed businesses without a ballot, and placed private influence over public process. It also set a standard inside his world for what competence looked like. When successors bragged into microphones or posed at nightclubs, old-timers shook their heads and muttered that the quiet boss would never have allowed it. That contrast is why his name is still invoked decades later when insiders debate method. The web he tended did not vanish when he did. Some strands snapped under the weight of wiretaps and RICO. Others frayed as new leaders chased faster money. Still others held and, in lowercase ways, still shape parts of the city's economy. That mixed durable patterns and broken safeguards tells you how much of himself he poured into systems rather than moments. He built a routine. He trained people to run it. He stepped back into the shadows and let the machine hum. The winter night outside the steakhouse cracked the spell Carlo had cast over his old house. A loud strike had replaced a whisper. From that moment, the story turned into a study in contrast. The new leader dressed sharp, smiled at cameras, and let a crowd form around him on sidewalks. Reporters gave him a name that slid off charges for a while. Courtrooms filled. Jurors listened to cases that mixed labor rackets, gambling, loans, and the same construction leverage Carlo had refined, only now told with photographs, news clips, and recordings. The city watched a spectacle. Men who had learned under Carlo watched the risk meter spike. The federal case aimed at the city's top council arrived first. Prosecutors laid out a chart of families, committees, and trades. They said leaders set policy, steered concrete, and took slices from projects across boroughs. Wiretaps, surveillance logs, and union records did the talking. Juries convicted. Long sentences landed on men who had believed meetings in quiet rooms kept them safe. That trial weakened the old council, limited its power to discipline, and showed that RICO could reach the top. Carlo had predicted that danger in his behavior. He had not been around to impose the same caution on the next wave. Even without him, parts of his machine kept running. Garment runs still depended on the right dispatchers. Airports still offered quiet pressure points. Private carding routes still turned into steady cash, as long as trade associations kept the peace. But the environment had changed. Bugs went where no one once imagined they could. Agents learned to sit on stoops in winter, memorize faces, and map who greeted whom. The new boss's ease with attention fed that learning. Crowds meant patterns. Patterns meant cases. The Staten Island home that Carlo would have treated like a museum became a theater of evidence under Paul. Agents had hidden microphones in fixtures and furniture. They captured a man who spoke at length in the supposed safety of his house. Those tapes, joined with union records and notes from confidential sources, gave later juries a full picture. After his death in Midtown, his recorded words did not vanish. They sat in boxes, waiting for trials that would follow. Carlo would have winced. He had spent a lifetime training his voice to avoid tape. On the street, the balance that Carlo had tended dissolved into winners and losers inside the same banner. Men who had lived by Delacroce's code of plain suits and tight lips lined up behind the new order because they resented Paul's distance and had lost their old anchor. Men who depended on office lines, contracts, and old family ties found themselves shut out. Promotions went to those who liked the spotlight. It felt good for a season. Prosecutors call that kind of season discovery. The new boss beat one big case in 1,987. A jury acquitted after a hard fight that included claims of tainted witnesses and shaky tapes. The nickname stuck harder. Cameras piled higher outside social clubs. Neighbors began to complain about the noise. Night after night, the same faces stood on the sidewalk like a daily broadcast. Carlo had taught that steady money loves quiet. The scene outside those clubs taught the opposite lesson to police. Keep listening. In April 1986, a car bomb killed Frank DeCicco, a key deputy for the new regime. The blast tore through a Brooklyn street. Law enforcement believed the strike came from rivals angered by the 1985 ambush. Frank had been loyal to Delacroce and then helped the transition, a bridge between a careful past and a louder present. Carlo would have understood what the blast meant beyond the loss. Public violence brings scrutiny that cannot be turned off. The FBI adjusted tactics again. The social club in Little Italy, where the new boss held court, proved hard to wire because of noise and foot traffic. Agents bugged an upstairs apartment used for private talks. The new tapes caught the rhythms that Carlo always hid. Who spoke, who deferred, how money moved, and how disputes were handled. The recording device did not care about persona. It collected words. Those words, along with paperwork collected by grand juries and payroll records from union locals, formed the backbone of a new federal case in the early 1990s. A trusted captain named Salvatore Gravano, known as Sammy, broke with the code and cooperated with the government in 1991. He had lived the split between the office and the street, had managed construction deals and club life, and knew how decisions had been made since the mid-1980s. His testimony walked jurors through rooms that Carlo had preferred to keep dark. He spoke calmly, placing dates, names, and meeting spots in order. The effect was enormous. The new boss was convicted in 1992 on racketeering and related counts, and received a life sentence. The camera-friendly era ended in a cell. Carlo's idea of leadership understated. Distant from microphones looked less like romance and more like armor. While trials played out, the city restructured parts of the economy that had fed Carlo's system. Manhattan prosecutors and city officials dismantled the closed world of private carding in the mid-1990s. Indictments hit carding companies and trade groups that, according to charges, had shut out competitors and fixed prices for years. A new agency with power to license haulers and vet owners remade the field. The predictable route, once a source of certain income, now came with oversight designed to keep out hidden partners. The quiet tolls Carlo had perfected disappeared in that sector. The Windows investigation in the 1990s exposed how 4 families had, for years, divided and controlled city housing authority contracts to replace apartment windows. Bids looked competitive. Outcomes weren't. The case produced convictions and long terms. It showed the logic Carlo had used in concrete: fewer suppliers, predictable schedules, a stable circle applied to another line of work. It also showed that by the 1990s, prosecutors could narrate that logic to juries with purchase orders, bank transfers, and recordings instead of rumor. Teamsters, locals tied to concrete trucking and building supply, saw trusteeships and reforms. Labor departments moved in. Monitors tracked votes and contracts. The waterfront, a pillar since Carlo's early days, came under renewed scrutiny. The Waterfront Commission tightened screening and disciplined stewards. A generation earlier, state and federal leaders had treated dock influence as tolerated grease so ships could sail. By the 1990s, the political calculus had shifted. Global shipping moved to container ports beyond New York's river slips. The harbor was less central. Reform was easier. Air cargo remained a magnet for theft and quiet influence. But it was not the wild field of the 1960s. Airports upgraded controls. Scanners, cameras, and tighter chains of custody reduced opportunities for the old style of misrouting or lost and found cargo. Where there were cases, they looked more like traditional theft rings than the union-driven leverage Carlo had favored. The city's garment center, once a daily goldmine of small fees, thinned as production moved overseas and fashion logistics changed. The district still bustled, but the river of money shrank to a stream. Through those shifts, the family that carried Carlo's name continued to mix blue-collar rackets and white-collar schemes. After the 1992 conviction at the top, acting leaders rotated. John Jr. Gotti, Peter Gotti, and others in the circle took turns trying to keep order. Each round faced the same pressure Carlo had anticipated but had managed to avoid: wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, broad RICO counts, and a press that treated the family as a saga. The more cameras stared, the more likely someone talked. What remained of Carlo's method still helped. Crews that stuck to gambling, loans, and small business extortion earned without drawing national heat. Men who kept phones at arm's length and avoided insider boasts at crowded tables ran fewer risks. But the scale was smaller. The city itself no longer offered the same friction points. A single dispatcher's desk no longer controlled half a borough's deliveries. A single clerk no longer decided which ship unloaded. Digital scheduling, private security, and compliance departments replaced parts of human patronage that had once been Carlo's canvas. Courts continued to echo with his name in 2 ways. First, prosecutors used his era to explain patterns to juries. A chairman who avoided drugs. A boss who made unions part of a toolkit. A strategist who preferred leverage to spectacle. They would describe policy choices and show how those choices created long-term income at low legal heat, adding that later leaders diverged from that path, paid for it, and dragged the whole house into more trouble. Second, some defendants invoked his standard to argue that certain policies were old cultural rules, not evidence of specific conspiracies. Judges, however, weighed documents and tapes more than tradition. Inside the life, older men told cautionary tales. They spoke of a boss who lived to his 70s at home, compared it to the new boss who lived a few high years under lights, and then vanished behind a door that would never open. They reminded anyone who would listen that phones were traps, that crowds were nets, and that the city had changed. Some learned. Others kept one foot in clubs, and the other in courtrooms. Law enforcement broadened beyond headline cases. Tax units mapped cash businesses. Insurance regulators followed claims in construction. City agencies embedded anti-corruption offices in departments that issued permits and licenses. That slow administrative mesh cut into the old way of doing business. A few envelopes could no longer fix a week. Delays were now automated. Carlo's leverage had leaned on people. As machines took their place, the levers shifted. By the early 2000s, when the press marked the passing of the man who had loved the camera, the Gambino name still moved in the city's rumor mill. But the scale was unfamiliar to Carlo's day. Investigations focused on boutique frauds, smaller trucking outfits, discrete identity theft rings, and niche labor rackets. Cases named people whose fame never left the courthouse steps. The grandeur was gone. The harm remained for those on the ground, but the story no longer played as a civic drama. It read like a string of mid-sized files. The long cleanup left an archive that historians now use to understand Carlo's original design. Transcripts from the late 1980s and 1990s show how union votes were counted, how companies were steered, how clubs set prices without a meeting on paper. Affidavits from reform monitors at union locals confirm how difficult it was to uproot patterns embedded over decades. Reports from airport task forces describe a quiet war of attrition in cargo theft and influence. Memoirs by agents, prosecutors, and former insiders place Carlo's choices on a timeline that starts with prohibition side streets and ends with courtrooms lined with microphones. There is a temptation to say that if Carlo had lived longer, the loud turn would not have happened. That flatters one man and ignores time. Laws changed. Technology changed. The city moved. His caution might have delayed some collisions, and his authority might have kept his house unified longer. But his model relied on people and places that a new century washed away. Container ports replaced finger piers. Overseas factories replaced Manhattan floors. Barcodes replaced clipboards. The machine he built hummed as long as those parts existed. What remains of him in this later period is style and a reputation for discipline. When underworld veterans judge a leader, they ask simple questions drawn from his example. Does he avoid hot trades? Does he keep meetings small? Does he respect the grind of day-to-day earners? Does he put order above theater? Carlo's answers were yes, 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 and yes. The men who followed gave mixed answers, and the record shows the results. Pulling back from the 1980s and 1990s, you see that the strongest link between Carlo's life and the city after him is the idea that power hides best in routine. He used predictable, unglamorous work to fund a large organization. He steered clear of temptations that touted quick money and brought long sentences. He built buffers that outlived him for a while and then failed when tested by microphones and pride. He kept faith with a principle that many people in his world still repeat. The quieter you are, the longer you last. The quiet did not make his choices less serious. Workers found their options narrowed. Businesses paid above market rates to avoid trouble. Union reformers faced obstacles built into process. That cost never makes the evening news the way a splashy trial does, but it marks lives. The later legal cleanup tried to widen those options again. In that sense, the city's reforms were not just about convictions. They were about undoing a method of control that had been designed to look like normal life. By the time you reach the end of this road, Carlo is long gone. His portrait built not from quotes, but from systems and outcomes. His name sits on a family that changed shape after he left it. His rules still get cited in rooms where men argue about strategy. His errors, if you can call them, that were omissions he avoided, like speaking freely in a room that might be wired, or chasing a trade that burned anyone near it. He spent his life trimming those risks. The city has a way of exposing every weakness, eventually. It took longer with him. He learned patience in a place where the wind carried news, and people kept their voices low. Sicily taught him that quiet could be a shield. The island's older men modeled restraint. Speak once, then listen. Settle debts without a parade. Remember who helped you, and who did not. Those habits followed him across the ocean. In New York, he found streets as crowded as fields at harvest and rules that felt familiar. Countrymen lived door to door. Favors still mattered. Officials came and went, but the neighborhood remembered. He did not try to change the city. He studied it until he could move through it without a bump. Prohibition turned study into work. Small crews moved bottles through alleys and basements. Trucks left at dawn with papers that looked official enough to pass a gate. He attached himself to men who already knew those routes. He learned which policemen ignored a shipment and which did not, which backlots offered cover and which shop owners paid on time. He did not drink much. He did not shout in bars. He earned a place by being steady when others bragged. When bosses feuded during the Castellamarese War, he stayed in the shadow of a doorway while louder men filled the street. In 1931, When the new order under Lucky Luciano divided New York into families and created a council to mediate disputes, he stepped into a system where patience could become power. Under Vincent Mangano, he led a crew that favored business over show. The family benefited from a tie that mattered more than most headlines. Influence on the Brooklyn docks through Albert Anastasia's brother, Anthony, a union leader with reach. The waterfront ran on schedules and favors. That fit Carlo's mind. He did not aim to grab a box with cameras watching. He aimed to adjust a list so a box moved first. Across the river, the garment district offered a similar map. Lots of hands, constant deadlines, and no appetite for delay. He put earners in places where one phone call could sort a week. It was not romantic. It was a blueprint. A conviction for tax evasion in 1937 became a hinge. He lost time. He studied how many cases began with paper, not guns. When he came home in 1939, he trimmed habits that could leave a trail. He walked more, drove less, and chose apartments over clubs for talks. He did not wear gold on his wrist. He watched for tails the way other men checked the clock. The Second World War turned the city into a logistics engine. He used that hum to his advantage, placing friendly faces in hiring halls and trucking depots. He did not try to be the public face of anything. He let rumor place him where it wanted while he placed others where he needed them. The late 1940s tested men who liked the spotlight. Vincent Mangano and Albert Anastasia fought a long, cold war inside their house. He did not take sides in public. He delivered money on time and discouraged his crew from picking petty battles. In 1951, the Mangano brothers vanished from the stage, and Anastasia took over. Carlo advanced without stepping into the camera light that followed his boss. He saw what that light did. Papers wrote nicknames. Detectives compared notes. He kept hands steady on the machines that paid. Docks, markets, loans, and gambling that kept to back rooms. The autumn of 1957 rearranged the board. Anastasia's murder opened a path that Carlo had prepared without saying so. He built consensus in hallways, not at rallies. Within weeks, a gathering in the countryside blew open the myth that there was no national structure. Appalachian made headlines and sent people running through hedges. Carlo, if present, left no record that day. In the months that followed, he moved the family toward his rules. No noise, no drugs, no big meetings. The dock stayed a core. Garment trucks stayed busy. Airports became part of the plan. He gathered allies who shared his taste for order. Above all, Thomas Lucchese, whose people held the garment center from another angle. Together they set a tone. Unions calm, schedules predictable, money steady. He picked his lieutenants for balance. Joseph Biondo, then Aniello della Croce, gave the street a figure to follow. Paul Castellano, tied to him by marriage, managed businesses that dealt with contracts and invoices. The split worked because he sat above it, and because he talked to each side in their own language. To Della Croce, he spoke about respect and envelopes. To Castellano, he spoke about markets and bids. He did not let either one believe they could steer alone. The family watched money arrive from bookmaking, loans, cargo, and construction supply, all at a pace that did not scare the neighbors. If a crew made noise, he sent a message, and sometimes a reassignment. The best discipline, he believed, is the kind that looks like a routine. The early 1960s brought plots and counterplots beyond his house. Joseph Bonanno and Joseph Magliocco tried to line up support to remove rivals. Word came through Joseph Colombo, who chose to inform rather than act. The council fined and forced resignations. Colombo took charge of a family and then tried to rebrand himself with a public league that rallied crowds and angered some leaders. Carlo did not imitate that approach. He stayed home, sent lawyers to speak for him, and kept his health at the center of his public posture. The weak heart story helped him manage courtroom time. He never argued with reporters. He gave them nothing. In 1963, when Joseph Valakai told the nation how Cosa Nostra worked, Carlo shortened his walks and tightened his circle. He did not deny. He disappeared. He made one line clear: stay out of narcotics. The policy served more than one purpose. It lowered legal risk at the top. It also defined culture, Crews who wanted to stay in favor stuck to gambling, loans, and leverage over schedules and permits. That did not stop every person connected to his house from trying drugs for a fast dollar, and some were caught. When they were, protection was thin. He believed that one big drug case could undo years of quiet work across unions and companies. He preferred to take smaller cuts from businesses that looked legitimate, and to build many pipes so no single leak drowned the house. The early 1970s forced him to make a rare example. His nephew was kidnapped for ransom in a reckless crime that mixed bravado and ignorance. The man linked to that act died the next year in a confrontation inside a tavern. The case led to arrests and prison for the crew that carried it out. The cycle affirmed a basic rule. Harm to family would not be absorbed as a cost of doing business. He did not need to go on television to state it. His world understood without a speech. Then he went back to routine, because he believed nothing invited attention faster than a victory dance. He fought deportation with filings and doctor's notes that suggested travel would harm him. He argued that he had built a life in New York and that age and health should end the matter. Hearings dragged. Appeals followed appeals. He remained in Brooklyn and on Long Island, walking the same blocks and visiting the same doctors. He had started in America as a teenager, with little paper and less money. He aimed to die in the house he had chosen, not on a ship back across the Atlantic. Time and courts gave him that end. When he felt his strength fade, he did not throw the choice of succession to fate. He asked Delacroce to accept a lower seat than his following might have justified, and named Paul Castellano to sit at the top, trusting that a family bond and a promise would prevent a fight. For a while it worked. Paul kept contracts flowing. Delacroce kept the rank and file disciplined. After Carlo's death in 1976, the balance held for almost a decade, long enough for prosecutors to perfect their tools and for cameras to change the mood of the street. Looking backward from the loud years that followed, you can see what he built by the shape of what broke. When a boss embraced the press, surveillance learned faster. When long talks filled a private room, microphones captured what Carlo had always refused to say. When quick cash from drugs tempted men who had once respected the old rule, federal sentences made examples. Even reforms in the economy told his story in reverse. The end of closed carting routes and the cleanup of window contracts showed how durable his models had been. They needed a new agency, monitors, and years of court orders to pry open. Behind the dates and names is a character sketch. He valued family dinners and quiet streets. He loved routine. He dressed simply and lived in houses that matched his taste for not being noticed. He trusted slow money. He believed that speeches are traps and that the best answer to a question is a nod. He did not try to be feared in a theatrical way. He preferred to be counted on, and he preferred that counting to happen without anyone saying his name out loud. He was not a myth. He was a manager of pressure points who kept attention elsewhere. If you need a single thread to tie his life together, choose this. He treated New York as a system and made patience his tool. When he was young, that meant waiting out street wars and learning who mattered behind a door. In middle age, it meant pushing influence into unions and trade groups, not just corners. In old age, it meant planning for a future he would not see and trusting that quiet habits would outlast him. Some did. Some could not survive microphones, new laws, and a taste for applause that he never shared. He left behind more questions than quotes. That is part of why his story lingers. Most bosses of his era are remembered for outbursts, recordings, or trials that turned into theater. Carlo Gambino is remembered for the opposite, an absence that forced people to read behavior, not speeches. To finish the walk, gather the pieces you have seen along the way and weigh them without romance. The man was a planner who bent systems. He was also a neighbor who waved from a stoop and kept to a narrow routine. Both things were true at once. Historians place him in a line that runs from Sicilian village codes to citywide syndicates. He did not invent the rules. He honored them. Omerta as silence, patience as strategy, family as duty, hierarchy as order. He carried those old lessons into a city where union halls replaced village councils and loading docks stood in for farm gates. Where others tried to win by fear, he tried to win by predictability. That approach made him rich, kept him free for decades, and left a fingerprint on whole industries. Detectives and prosecutors, looking back, point to three pillars that made his model hard to crack. First, diversification. He took a slice from many pies: gambling, loans, waterfront, garment transport, airports, construction supply, private carting, so a single raid could not empty the cupboard. Second, insulation. Buffers stood between him and the act: stewards, foremen, aides, relatives, front owners. Third, restraint. He pushed his people toward low-visibility crimes and away from narcotics, the trade that sent other bosses away for life. Each pillar had cracks, but together they held for an unusually long time. Workers and reformers remember a different side: narrowed choices, slow-burning pressure, and institutions bent to private ends. A shop owner paid above market for carting because the standard rate was fixed by custom. A trucker who favored the wrong company found shifts disappearing. A steward who resisted a slate lost ground in the next vote. The harm rarely shouted. It sat inside everyday transactions, which made it harder to expose and easier to live with until someone tried to pry it open. That is why later reforms took years and layers of oversight to unwind. His legacy in other families is a measure, not a myth. Older figures told younger men to study him for method. Do not call unless you must. Meet in places you control. Keep crews small. Pay attention to schedules. They are leverage. Treat violence as a last resort. It draws heat. Honor the no. Drugs line. The profits look big, but the cases are bigger. When men ignored those rules, their trials became cautionary tales where jurors listened to recordings from bugged rooms and watched videos from sidewalk crowds. The contrast flattered his caution because reality did the comparison for him. Culture, with its appetite for spectacle, mostly skipped him. Films and series gave attention to louder personalities, sometimes borrowing his name for a headline but rarely capturing his style. That suits the record. He did not dress like a movie star or stand on the curb to shake hands with cameras. He did not offer quotable lines to reporters, slam doors on cue, or flinch for effect. If a script wants a scene, it reaches for fireworks. Carlo built a career avoiding matches. Law enforcement's narrative of him matured over time. In the 1950s, agencies thought in terms of cases and individuals. By the 1960s and 1970s, they had begun to map structures, family charts, union ties, trade associations that acted like gates. The Valakai testimony in 1963 offered language for juries. RICO in 1970 offered a framework that treated many acts as one enterprise. Electronic surveillance shrank. With each step, the space in which a Carlo-style boss could move grew smaller. He had already built a life around silence. That is why he outlasted so many peers. He reached old age at home. Most top men did not. He did not operate alone. The network matters. Allies like Thomas Lucchese provided a stable partner whose people controlled crucial routes in the garment center and had influence in construction. Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia offered a quiet border. In New Jersey, figures with similar instincts kept bridges open. Inside his own house, Delacroce delivered discipline on the street, while Castellano managed contracts and companies with ties to food, concrete, and supply. That blend made the family large and adaptable. It also built the fault line that would crack after his death, because no one else carried his talent for holding both wings in balance. His deportation saga shows the limits of even a careful plan. The government tried to send him back to Italy based on how he entered the United States. In 1921, he answered with lawyers, filings, and a long trail of medical notes. Judges weighed paperwork, while time did its slow work. He never left. The process reveals his approach. Contest every move at the lowest temperature possible, avoid dramatic confrontations, and run out the clock when you can. It was not exciting. It was effective. The kidnapping of his nephew is a rare place where raw emotion touched his method. The crime mixed recklessness and misreading of the world he ruled. The response swift, targeted, and ultimately costly to the kidnappers, told insiders that some lines could not be crossed. It also shows how his justice worked. Not a public show, not a broadcast, but an internal decision executed by trusted hands. Afterward, he returned to normal days, because normal was his shield. The city's economy changing under his feet, both empowered and limited him. While he reigned, New York ran on labor-intensive systems. Piers where men and paper ruled, garment floors that needed daily deliveries, construction sites scheduled by hand, airports run by shift bosses with clipboards. Human discretion created leverage points. In later decades, containerization, outsourcing, and digital controls reduced those points. That is one reason his model does not transplant neatly into newer eras. He was a master of a particular city at a particular time. Consider his public image. A small man who walked Ocean Parkway, took the air, and visited doctors. That picture came from surveillance and neighbors, not an agent's fantasy. Friends remembered him as courteous, quick to ask about family, slow to trust, unwilling to brag. That demeanor steadied his cruise. If the top stays calm, the middle relaxes, and the bottom produces. His attention to tone became a form of governance. He understood that panic travels faster than orders. Ethically, the ledger is not clean. He did not throw stones in tabloids, but he did bend unions and markets to private advantage. He trained men to turn public processes into private checkouts. Businesses that played along survived, some thrived. Those that resisted paid in delays and costs they could not sue away without naming what everyone avoided naming. The damage seldom appeared as a headline. It lived in thin margins and foregone choices. That is part of his accuracy as a historical figure. He was a quiet driver of unfairness at scale. When he died in 1976, he left a machine that could run without him for a time. The model kept envelopes full, kept courts at bay, and kept the peace between two very different styles under one roof. His chosen successor, Paul, had strengths that matched half the job but habits that produced the kind of evidence Carlo avoided. The underboss he trusted to keep the street steady, Delacroix, did so until illness took him. After that, the balance failed, and the era of applause replaced the era of nods. The consequences are written in indictments, not just in lore. The afterstory public murders, headline trials, cooperating witnesses, reforms in carting, windows, and concrete casts his restraint in sharper relief. It does not make him noble. It makes him distinct. He did not stop harm. He spread it out and hid it in schedules, lists, and contracts. He judged risk like an actuary. He made the city pay him in the least visible ways it could. When later leaders sought applause, they gave prosecutors the very thing he had denied them: narrative, sound, and spectacle. What endures is a set of reminders that extend beyond his world. Systems matter more than slogans. Routine is power. Risk is a daily choice, not just a crisis response. Silence can be armor, but it can also be cover for harm. In a city that rewards attention, there is another economy that rewards the opposite. He mastered that second economy. He measured success by years at home, not nights on the front page, by the fact that neighbors knew him as a polite elder, not as a man arraigned under bright lights. If you walk his old streets now, much has changed. The garment center is smaller, the docks quieter, the airports digital, the unions monitored. Yet pieces of his logic still show. Projects live by schedules. Companies pay for predictability. People who control time and order still carry hidden weight. The difference is that oversight has grown, and the city learned to ask more questions about how normal gets made. In that sense, the long shadow of his career helped inspire reforms designed to shorten the next shadow. And that was the story of Carlo Gambino, the quiet strategist who shaped an empire from the shadows, ruling with patience, silence, and power that few could ever match. As his legacy fades into history, may his story drift softly into your dreams tonight. Thank you for joining me here at the Silent Empires. Don't forget to share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I love knowing where these stories find you. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to stay with us for more tales of gangsters and forgotten empires. Rest well, sleep deeply, and good night.